in times like this, when we reminisce, I thought about asking or trying to find out who had been a member of this church the longest in this building, and then it dawned on me that it has to be me, believe it or not. And the reason it has to be me was because I attended the first service of what was to become the Northside Assembly of God, believe it or not. Amen. When I was just a teenager in Bible school, and I was just quite young because I graduated from Bible school when I was just 18. And this was a couple of years before that, and we had gospel teams in those days, and I was the head of a gospel team. There were 8 in these gospel teams, and the fellow who was the head of it always did the preaching. And the dean of boys that year was Nathan MacDonald. And he felt led of God to start a church, and so he came to me and said, "Would you help me? Your gospel team." I said, "Well, sure." At that time, we were assigned to the Fostepco Heights Church. And we went up that night, and I'll never forget it. It was an old hamburger stand. And in those days, not everybody ate hamburgers like they do now. It wasn't like McDonald's. It was an old deserted hamburger stand up on North Main, somewhere just beyond where 28th Street goes into North Main now. 28th Street wasn't there then. And it was up beyond there somewhere. And that night when I was and Sister McDonald, and there was the 8 folk that comprised our gospel team, and there were 2 elderly ladies, and that was it. And on top of that, it was raining that night. And I sat down there on a bench in that old hamburger stand, and I said, "Lord, what on earth have I gotten myself into?" But I was brave, and I stuck it out. And we kept having services for a little while, and then we moved up. And you can believe it or not, Brother McDonald said one day, "Well, we've just bought a little building on the back of a lot, just 1 block off of North Main and 33rd. And at that time, Buddy's had his first open-air grocery there on the corner. There was just one little Buddy's store, and it looked about like a 7-Eleven, little open-air thing, and we were just a block away from it. And he said, "We bought a little building on the back of a lot." And he said, "You boys want to go help me?" "Sure, we will go." But I didn't know what I was getting into. We got up there that morning, and it was a chicken house. I mean, one the chickens lived in. And they had lived in it, and nobody had cleaned it up since then. And so we got in there, and we cleaned up that chicken house. And I mean, it was so deep, and chickens haven't been there until you had to use a shovel. Amen. There wasn't a thing on the front of the lot. It was on the back of a lot and nothing on the front of the lot. And we divided into 3 little rooms, and that was where we started. And about that time, Brother McDonald had to leave, and so Brother Millard Collins, who at that time was superintendent of the school, it was Shield of Faith then, took it over. So we built a little building on the front of the lot that later became the primary department down at Northside. And built that little building on the front of the lot and moved into it, and that's when the church was set in order with 23 charter members. And I was one of the charter members, and my mother was another one. And Gene, was you a charter member? You were a charter member. And that just left 20 more. And we had it. And then a little while later on Christmas week, they decided to move it down to Clinton and Exchange. It was the Washington Heights Assembly of God. This church has had a lot of names. It started out as the Washington Heights Assembly of God, 23 members up on the corner of something and something else. Amen. And so that Christmas week, we had to move it between midnight and daylight. Those were city regulations. And we had to be all ready at midnight and be on Clinton and Exchange by sunup. And we did. And one of the first members was a Sister Mayfield. I don't know that she was any relation at all to the Mayfields that come here now, but it was Sister Mayfield, and she lived right down the street. And I remember that morning she got up real early. She was bitterly opposed to moving to church because she lived right down the street. She got up and she sat in the front window when we went by about 1 o'clock in the morning, and she said, "There goes the devil with the church." Amen. There goes the devil with it. And so we moved it down, and it became Exchange Avenue Assembly of God. That was its second name. And for a little while it was Exchange Avenue Assembly of God, and then it became Northside Assembly of God. And that old original building became the primary department. And that time then the war started. I had to go away Well, I did go away. I got out of Bible school and went on away and pastored in Pennsylvania for a year. Then the war came along and spent 7 years in the Air Force. And during that time, it built and burned once by arsons and built back. And Brother Filbert became the pastor. And I remember when I came back after 7 years in the Air Force and became the Sunday school superintendent of the children's departments. At that time, Brother Guy Wilson was the Sunday school superintendent of the adult departments. And I was superintendent from on up past the intermediates. And that was in November of 1949. November of 49. And I have been then continuously with the church ever since that time. So I know that I've been with this church longer than anybody else in here, because there wasn't a one of you with me that old rainy night when we went to that hamburger stand on North Main. Amen. You say, man, I didn't know you was that old. Well, I am. Glory. And I think that actually this church is almost, the history of this church has almost been my history in the full gospel, because I was just at that time shortly out of the Baptist church as a teenage boy. Been raised a Southern Baptist, and through the years I've seen this church grow until we've reached the point we have tonight. And I don't know if I'll be here when the Lord comes or not. He may come before the night is over anyhow. Well, glory.
I might, there's people, sure, enough people have asked me to write this down, but actually when I was 15, my folks had moved to Bridgeport, and Brother Collins was pastoring the Bridgeport church. We had moved there because my uncle had a coal mine my dad was he'd hit him running, and we were told we were staunch Baptists. But my cousin asked me if I could go to church with him, and I said, sure, I'd be glad to. And it was an Assembly of God church. First time in my life I had never been in another church besides a Baptist church. I was just 13 in it, but anyhow, I wound up being Assembly of God. And so Brother Collins sort of took me under his arm like I was his son. And in those days, Shield of Faith that had been moved from Amarillo to Fort Worth in an old Catholic orphanage they had bought out here in Fort Worth on the Denton Highway. And Brother Guy Shields had gotten Brother Collins to be the president of the Shield of Faith Bible Institute because he's one of the few men he could find who had a degree. Brother Collins had been a minister in the Christian church, the Disciples of Christ. He had a degree. And he just brought me down. He didn't ask me if I wanted to come or not. In those days, Shield of Faith had the last 2 years of Bible school, this junior and senior years. So it's my junior year. I was just 14 in my junior year, and so he just simply one night put me in his car and brought me back to Fort Worth with him. And that's how I got into Shield of Faith. But the next year when I was a senior, I took my first year of Bible Institutes the same year, and just 15. And that year, Brother Collins organized what he called gospel teams. There were 8 in a team. The girls and boys didn't have mixed, but they did have high school kids and Bible school kids mixed in each group. And they had a Bible school kid, though, ahead of each group. But for some reason that I don't know until this day, the group I wound up in, even though I was a senior in high school, it was my first year of Bible school too. Brother Collins made me the head of that team. And so my gospel team, he decided that year then he wanted to show the students how to start a church from the beginning. And he chose my team to do it. He worked with us. We found a little abandoned store building down on North Main and started the church that later became the Northside Assembly of God. And so I feel like I've kind of been with it from the beginning because as a 15-year-old boy it was my gospel team that started it. And we were there for quite a while in that abandoned building, and it got filled up because people lived pretty close in then. So decided to move where Brother Collins were working with us. And we found a vacant lot up in what was Washington Heights then. The house had burned down on the front of it, but it had a chicken house on the back of the lot, and it was a chicken house that happened to have a wooden floor. And I remember it was one Saturday, my gospel team, I was there, we tore out the roofs, swept the floor, got all the chicken droppings out, brought in some bacon, some folding chairs, and started a church there, moved up to North Main. Well, the crowd began to grow until wound up we built quite a nice small church building on the front of the lot where the house had burned down. And then Brother Collins decided he would be the pastor. The church was set, he made me then the youth leader. The church was set in order and was called the Washington Heights Assembly of God. Now, I don't know why, but sometime later then decided he needed to move. And we found this vacant lot down on the corner of Clinton and Exchange. And the city told us we could move, but we had to do it at night. We could not be on the street in the daytime. And I remember that so well. It was on Christmas week. And at sundown that evening, a moving company had that little building that we built on the front of the lot up on the platform. And by daylight the next morning, it was sitting on the ground on the corner of Clinton and Exchange, and became the Exchange Avenue Assembly of God. And so I still was with it there. So I kind of have been with it since the beginning. People won't be to write this down, but never have yet. But I might one of these days. And as the days went by, though, Brother Collins, of course, was the pastor. And then my days were over at school. I was just 18 when I graduated. And I went right to Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and established there the first Assembly of God in Williamsport. Came home, and in Thanksgiving that year, and a little later then I joined the Air Force. The war had begun, the war was going on, and I was 8.5 years in the Air Force. The first 4.5 years, heavy bombardment, there B-17s and B-20 and B-24s. The last 4 years in Air Transport Command. But then it wound up that in the last few months of my enlistment, because of something that would make a tremendous testimony, they sent me to Carswell Hospital to die. But God healed me, totally healed me. And so my sister, many of our younger sister Jean, had married, and she was going then to what the name then had changed by that time to Northside Assembly of God. And so on a Wednesday night, I was out at Carswell. I decided I'd just go in and have something to do. So I went in from Carswell to that business meeting. It was just a Sunday school workers meeting on Wednesday night. I sat in the back row. I hardly knew anybody by that time. And the meeting was over, and Brother Filbert then, of course, was pastor. And he dismissed, and everybody was standing up talking. So he said, "Everybody get quiet, everybody get quiet." And everybody got quiet, and he pointed at me and said, "God just told me that that young man in uniform is to be our Sunday school superintendent." And that started 28 years with Northside. Of course, during that 28 years, we expanded the building, built a Sunday school annex, and beyond, built a big auditorium there, and then eventually built what's now Bethesda. And after 2 years out there, I resigned because we spent 5 years in teaching seminars around the nation. And then I took South Lake, where I've been 17 years. But I feel like I kind of know this church because as a 15-year-old boy, head of a gospel team, we started it in an empty church, in an empty tool building on North Main. And it became Northside Assembly of God. Well, they've asked us to sing. I just want to put that in because it's a part of history that most people don't know, because most of that first part up to the Washington, there have been several people that have said to me lately, "Well, I remember when it was Washington Heights Assembly of God." I said, "Yeah, that's after we cleaned out the chicken house."